Good morning. So good to be with you this morning. We are in Mark chapter 14. About halfway through that chapter, Mark chapter 14. We'll pick up in verse 32 here in just a moment. We're towards the very end of Jesus' life on earth. We've been emphasizing how Jesus has spent so much of his time at the end of the Gospel of Mark in the temple and going back and forth between the temple and Bethany. And in the last class, the first half of chapter 14, we've looked at two different meals that Jesus was a part of. In the first one, we saw him as the guest, and in the second one, as the host. And we talked about how there's two different sandwiches or Oreo structure that Mark likes to use so frequently. In the first sort of sandwich here is we see the chief priests and scribes are seeking to find an opportunity, some way to take Jesus by trickery and put him to death. And in verses 10 and 11, they find it. Judas comes to them offering up his services to betray Jesus to them for money. And in the middle of that story about them seeking that way to betray Jesus, to take him by trickery, we get this picture of this woman that comes to Jesus and gives everything to him. That she is willing to make this tremendous sacrifice of this very costly oil, which the disciples estimated to be worth about 300 denarii, which was a tremendous sum of money. I find it interesting that the disciples didn't seem to have an issue with the widow at the end of chapter 12 who offered her 2 mites, even though that was everything that she had. But then here in chapter 14, we see this woman who gives seemingly so much of what she had to Jesus. And Jesus comes to her defense and says, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a good work for me." So we get that contrast between Judas selling Jesus for whatever he can get him for, and then this woman coming and making this tremendous sacrifice for Jesus. And then in the next section, we see the Lord's Supper, Jesus instituting that with his disciples. And that's sandwiched in between Jesus talking about how the disciples are going to betray him and deny him and run from him. Verse 27 says, "I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered." And so we get the contrast there between the disciples being faithless and forsaking Jesus in his time of need to Jesus instituting this covenant that I'm going to give myself for you. I think that's such a beautiful picture of God remaining faithful even when we are faithless to him. So I want to appreciate those stories and just how deliberate Mark seems to be with the structure. How there's more there than you originally see when you come to it and analyze these stories sort of in isolation. There's a progression, there's a thought being developed, and Mark's very intentional with the way that he puts these stories together. And I always want to appreciate that. It makes me want to look at the other sections in Mark more where I don't see as strong of a connection between the stories, because I know it's there. I just haven't seen it yet. So I want to continue to look in for those connections as well. Yes?
Just this part about the Lord's Supper when he institutes it, and they go out to the Mount of Olives. But before they go out to the Mount of Olives, it says they sang a hymn. And that strikes me, and has struck me for some time, how we might normally think that Jesus would pray. And we might pray in a situation like that. He knows what's about to come. And this is a terribly emotional turmoil time for him. And I think Jesus gets what our emphasis in this gospel meeting is about. They sang a hymn at this troublesome time. And that must have given comfort to Jesus.
Yeah, very good. And so often in Scripture, we see people singing after something has happened, almost in response to something that has been done. And I think that's what's happening here, that after instituting the Lord's Supper, that's the appropriate reaction that we should have, is praise, is this response of singing hymns to our God because of what he has done for us. So I think that's a really beautiful connection here. This is the only time we see Jesus singing hymns in the Gospel of Mark, and it's at this moment, which is obviously a critical moment in his life and a critical moment for us as well. All right, let's read verses. Stephen.
Also, another side note, it's possible that the hymn they sang was Psalm 115 through 118. From history, we know the Jewish tradition singing Psalm 113 and 114 before the Passover meal, and 115 through 118 after the Passover meal. It's also really cool because Psalm 118 is quoted a lot in the Passover week sequence. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And
Yeah.
So it's really powerful to read those Psalms, thinking about them from Jesus' perspective on that night.
Yeah. Yeah, very good. Yeah, we saw that they were singing that as Jesus came into Jerusalem in chapter 11, and then he asked the chief priests and scribes, have you never read this psalm? At the beginning of chapter 12, talking about their rejection of him, which is exactly what's about to happen. And so, yeah, it's a really, really strong connection there as well. All right, let's go ahead and read verses 32 through 42. Mark chapter 14, beginning in verse 32. Then they came to a place which was named Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. And he took Peter, James, and John with him, and he began to be troubled and deeply distressed. Then he said to them, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch. He went a little farther and fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will. Then he came and found them sleeping and said to Peter, Simon, are you sleeping? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Again he went away and prayed and spoke the same words. And when he returned, he found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. Then he came the third time and said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? It is enough. The hour has come. Behold, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. All right, so after the Passover, it's in verse 26, it said they went out to the Mount of Olives, and in verse 32, we've arrived at a place which is named Gethsemane. And what does Jesus do with the disciples once they arrive in Gethsemane?
He's with the 11, and he tells them to sit here while I pray. Apparently he's talking to 8 of them. This is Peter, James, and John. And with him to the next step, and then told them to watch while he went a little farther to pray.
Yeah, very good. So again, we see the sort of inner circle with Jesus of Peter, James, and John. But they've come here for the purpose of prayer, to just take this time and to pray to God. And he encourages them to do the same. Sit here while I pray. In verse 34, stay here and watch. So they're supposed to be on the alert. And then he goes and he falls on the ground. And he prays that if it were possible, the hour might pass for him. These are Jesus' last few hours of freedom before his arrest and ultimately his death. And this is the way that he wants to spend that time, is just in prayer to God. And he encourages the disciples to participate in that with him, that they're supposed to be watching as well. And I think verse 36 is obviously such a beautiful, beautiful verse here. All things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will. I think this is a really beautiful template for how we should be constructing our prayers when we have a request of God. Verse 35 says, he prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And that question of possibility is not a question of God's capability. It's a question of God's will. And I think that's really instructive for us. That when we come to God with requests, we need to never come with questions about God's ability, God's capacity to answer our prayers. But we need to come in submission to his will. And that's something that I personally have struggled with some, is just the idea of, why would I pray to God? Why would an almighty God listen to me? Why should he even listen to me? Like, I should just pray that he should do whatever he's going to do. But throughout Scripture, we see people coming with requests of God, but they make those requests acknowledging his power and his wisdom and in submission to his will. And we've seen people come with other mindsets. In chapter 9, the man with the demon-possessed son, he said, if you can do anything, please help me. And Jesus kind of pushes back against that and says, if you can believe, all things are possible for him who believes. But we've also seen those who come with that very same mindset that we see Jesus have here. Like in chapter 1, the leper that comes to Jesus. He falls before Jesus and says, if you are willing, you can make me clean. So again, that idea of, he has complete confidence in Jesus' power and Jesus' ability to solve this problem. The only question is his will. Is it your will to make me clean? I have no doubts that you can, but I'm submissive to whatever your will might be for this. This is just what I desire. So I think that's a really beautiful and helpful template for me to see the kind of attitude that I ought to have when I come to God, making requests of some sort from him. All right, question 2. Sam, why did Jesus want Peter, James, and John to watch and pray?
I love these questions that there is no specific answer to, but I think there's some deductions we can make. This is a very critical time in the life of Jesus. The hour is at hand for him to go to the cross. The flesh is struggling. It's a very difficult time. And so he needs support. He needs comfort. And I think he wants the power of prayer by his disciples to help aid him. Not just his prayers, but them to pray as well. He's taught them that, he's come to this hour, that it's coming, what's going to take place. They should be aware of that by now. And then if you go down to verse 38, we also see when he comes back and they're asleep, he asked them to pray, for themselves because of the temptation that they're fixing to go through. So not just for himself, I think he wanted them to pray for themselves as well.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I think verse 38 is very significant. Watch and pray lest you enter into temptation. And it is interesting to me, the verse 37, that he calls out Peter. And this is much like earlier in the book here, in verse 30, when he calls out specifically Peter and says, assuredly I say to you that today, even this night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter denies it. He speaks more vehemently. If I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And then the last line there is also significant. They all said likewise. Peter's not the only one that had this attitude of, no, I'm never gonna deny you in this way. I'm gonna be faithful. I'm gonna stay loyal to you. And yet Peter is sort of held up as the leader of the apostles, and he's the one that's sort of focused on as this having this mindset of no, this is not true. I would never deny you in this way. And Jesus is saying, well, you need to be praying about this. Watch and pray lest you enter into temptation. And he calls out Peter specifically and says, could you not watch 1 hour? And so I do think this is tied to the temptation that they're about to face. Jesus had already said that they were going to forsake him. They were going to be made to stumble because of him this night. And so that's something that should have been on their hearts. They should have been praying about that and asking for God's strength. And it does seem significant to me that 3 times Jesus comes and says, you should have been praying about this. And then we see later in the chapter that 3 times Peter denies him. So there seems to be a connection there as well. That they were not prepared for this battle that they were about to face because of their lack of prayer. And that's not the first time we've seen that in the Gospel of Mark either. Again, back in chapter 9, they couldn't cast out the demon, and they were very confused by that. And they asked Jesus, why could we not cast it out? And he says, this kind can come out by nothing but prayer. And I don't think the idea there is that they should have just said a prayer right there in the moment when that demon-possessed boy was brought to them, and then they could have casted it out. It seems to be sort of a pattern, a lifestyle, that this is something that you should have been participating in more and more. And we've seen that reflected in Jesus' life. He continually is seeking solitude, seeking time away in isolation where he can pray to God throughout the Gospel of Mark. But we haven't seen that with the disciples. So I think there's a connection there of our ability to fight these spiritual battles that are coming is directly tied to our prayer. Are we actively preparing ourselves through prayer to face the spiritual battles that are coming? We need to be aware of those things. And thinking about what we're going to have to face in the future so that we can be prepared and be praying for strength for those moments. Any other thoughts about that idea, that question? Michael?
Just a simple thought, though. Sometimes the answer is no. If God tells Jesus no,
Yeah.
he'll tell us no.
Very good. Yeah, very, very good. All right. Any other thoughts or comments about this section as a whole through verse 42 before we move forward?
It is striking how little these apostles are aware, or seem to be aware, but like Sam said, they should have been aware because of all that he had been saying leading up to this moment. And they're just so blasé about it, that they fall asleep multiple times, and they don't see, they don't get, apparently, the profound moment that they're facing at this point, and they're just so bland about it that they're just able to drift off to sleep instead of just being on heightened alert.
It also says something to me about Jesus' attitude in prayer here. I mean, in verse 37, could you not watch 1 hour? It was not that Jesus stepped away and said these, the words of verse 36 in 12 seconds and then came back and they were asleep again. Jesus is praying for a long time because this is on his heart. This is so serious to him. He's overwhelmed with this sorrow. And so he's spending a lot of time here in prayer to God. And the disciples don't have the endurance right now. They're exhausted. And so they fall asleep. I thought it was interesting, verse 39. He went away and prayed and spoke the same words. We see vain repetition in prayer being condemned in the book of Matthew. But sometimes I think I've thought more that repetition was the problem than the vain part is the problem. But if this is what is really on your heart, then you should be praying about that all the time. That's one of the most common instructions regarding prayer that I see in Scripture is you need to do it a lot. You need to always be praying. Pray without ceasing. Be persistent. And if this is something that's truly on our hearts, then we need to be praying about it all the time. And that's what we see Jesus doing here, is just praying and praying and praying with all the time that he has left. Because this is what's on his heart. All right. Any other, Kevin?
I used to wonder why every preacher ended his sermon with, if you're subject to the invitation, we invite you to come always stand. Well, it's because the situation is exactly the same every single time. And this is what it was. He was in exactly the same situation that he was an hour ago. I've had the same thing. Why do you do it repeatedly? Well, there's nothing wrong with doing it repeatedly if it's the same situation.
Yep. Very good.
Those are the words that you use in this situation.
Very good. Brad?
I never cease to be amazed at how the names of places turn out to be significant. Gethsemane means olive press, or oil press, rather. And as oil is frequently used as a figure for the Spirit, and the flowing oil and the flowing of the Spirit. So because of this tremendous pressure that Jesus and his apostles are under, there is going to be a flowing of the Spirit that comes out of this.
Very good. Appreciate that connection. Brian?
I think the whole scene is interesting because Jesus is always teaching them. This is a teaching moment, even here. But you go back to Mark chapter 13, and obviously that's in the context of judgment, but he says, you don't know when the master of the house will come. Verse 36, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep.
Yeah.
And what I say to you, I say to all, stay awake. That same language is applied right here during this moment of temptation. So he's trying to teach them to resist temptation. And he's really giving them an illustration of what that looks like, and an illustration of what he's already been teaching about the judgment back in Mark chapter 13, rather. And then you connect that with Peter and all of them saying, "Hey, we'll fight for you."
Yeah.
And I just like the connection there.
Yeah, be on the alert. That's true of the judgment that's coming from on Jerusalem, and it's true in this moment as well. Did I see another hand? Jim?
And just to follow up with what Brian said, this is our teaching moment too. We need to be watching and waiting to be ready because our day is coming too.
Yeah, very good. All right, let's go ahead and read the next section here, verses 43 through 52. And immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now his betrayer had given them a signal, saying, "Whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him and lead him away safely." As soon as he had come, immediately he went up to him and said to him, "Rabbi, Rabbi," and kissed him. Then they laid their hands on him and took him. And one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus answered and said to them, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to take me? I was daily with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled." Then they all forsook him and fled. Now a certain young man followed him, having a linen cloth thrown around his naked body. And the young men laid hold of him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. All right, so Jesus says in verse 41 that the hour has come. The Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. And immediately, while he's still speaking, Judas comes. And who's coming with Judas here to arrest Jesus?
Being led by Judas, and then scribes and priests, chief priests, who were with them with clubs and swords coming.
Yeah. A great multitude with swords and clubs came from the chief priests and scribes and the elders. So they sent this group, this multitude who are armed, to come and take Jesus away. And Judas is the one that is leading them to Jesus. Because again, Jesus has this pattern of behavior that he's in the temple during the day, and then in the evening, they retreat away out of the city to the area of Bethany. And so Judas knows his pattern. He knows where he's going to be, and so he's able to come and lead them to him so that they can arrest him. Kevin.
You got to wonder what the pep talk was that the scribes and chief priests gave the multitude to round them up to get them there. That's not given that speculation.
Yeah.
But they had some influence.
Yeah, very good. So this is a multitude that they're sending, sort of their representatives to come and arrest Jesus. And we've seen the reason that they were afraid. There's another question about this, I think. The reason they were so afraid to take him in the temple is because of what they knew the people thought Jesus to be. They knew Jesus had tremendous respect. The people loved listening to him. The people saw a tremendous distinction between Jesus and them, their authority, their teaching. And so they didn't want to cause an uproar, as it says in verse 2 of chapter 14. Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar of the people. And yet now they have this multitude that is coming to arrest Jesus. Yeah.
Lance mentioned this, I apologize. He says in verse 41, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. So who came to arrest Jesus? Sinners.
Yeah. Very good. But this is the same group that we've seen, the elders, chief priests, and scribes. This is the same group that we've seen be hostile to Jesus throughout the book. At the end of chapter 11, they're the ones that came to Jesus after he cleansed the temple and said, "By what authority are you doing this? Who gave you this authority?" And then we see them in chapter 12. They're the ones that Jesus gave that prophecy or that parable to about the wicked vine dressers, that they were supposed to be in charge of this vineyard that God had of Israel. They were supposed to be the leaders and giving back to God the fruit that he should be receiving from it. And yet they were killing those that had been sent by God. And now we see them fulfilling that role that Jesus ascribed to them in that parable. Yes.
I know you're trying to stay within the book of Mark, but I have found this detail fascinating in Luke. This is before they take him to the high priest's house. In Luke 22, verse 52, then Jesus said to the chief priests, captains of the temple, and elders who had come to him. So it sounds as if these are not just people that the priests and captains of the temple had sent. They had either come along so they could be sort of an audience to watch, or they were among the ones who were armed and taking them themselves. So it wasn't just people that they rounded up. They were part of this party as well.
Yeah. Very good. I appreciate that distinction or clarification there. All right, so question 4, we've already talked about this a little bit. Why did Jesus say they didn't arrest him when he was in the temple? And that's Jesus' response, that they come with this great multitude with swords and clubs, and they lay hold of him. And he says, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to take me? I was daily with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me, but the scriptures must be fulfilled. So they come to him so hostile. It's like they're expecting this tremendous fight, and Jesus is sort of baffled by that. Like, I've been with you in the open all this time, and you could have arrested me there, but you did not. Again, I think the implication is because of their fear of the people. They wanted to do it in isolation, away from the crowds that were supporting Jesus. But they're doing this in this way by trickery, again, in the darkness. That's not how righteousness behaves, but that's how they've approached their arrest of Jesus. And then verse 50, then they all forsook him and fled. And that sort of reminds me of verse 31, that they all said likewise with Peter that, no, we would never do this. We would never betray you. If I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And then here just a few verses later, they all forsake him and they all flee away. No one is standing with Jesus in this hour of need. Verse 51 and 52 seems very interesting. This is the only gospel that records this young man who's following Jesus with just a linen cloth around his naked body, and they lay hold of him, and he leaves the linen cloth and flees away from them naked. Some people speculate that perhaps this was Mark himself who was this young man. That's highly speculative. I don't know that we can say that with any degree of confidence. I think really the idea here is just that this is someone who's a young man who you would think would be the most prone to be courageous and sort of idealistic and willing to stand and fight with Jesus. And yet not only does even this young man flee, he flees at the cost of shame. He's willing to leave his clothes behind and run away from them naked. And I think this harkens back to some Old Testament ideas as well. Amos chapter 2, let's look at this very quickly. Amos chapter 2, verse 13, this is talking about judgment against Israel. It says, "Behold, I am weighed down by you, as a cart full of sheaves is weighed down. Therefore flight shall perish from the swift, the strong shall not strengthen his power, nor shall the mighty deliver himself. He shall not stand who handles the bow, the foot of the swift shall not escape, nor shall he who rides a horse deliver himself. The most courageous men of might shall flee naked in that day." So we get this picture of the strong are fleeing in shame. And that's the exact same image that we see here with Jesus' arrest. That those who should have been courageous, those who should have been standing with him, they're all fleeing. Everyone is fleeing, even at the cost of shame to themselves. Kevin?
Jesus pointed out the woman that gave 2 mites for all history to know. Jesus pointed out the woman that anointed him with oil for all history to know. If there had been one, and all the disciples forsook him and fled, except Bartholomew, Bartholomew would have gotten credit for all history to know who did not forsake Jesus. How many times would we be the ones that do not forsake Jesus when the crowd does?
Very good. Lance?
So I know Mark doesn't name the one that is struck into the ear of the mountains, but it's interesting here at this point, as they're coming to get Jesus, something happens where another miracle is performed right there in front of these people. And, to me, it's like, what's the thought of the people around that saw the sword cut the ear off, Jesus pick it up and put it back on his head? What kind of thought process are those people going through when they see such an amazing thing happen? They're about to take this man away to kill him. It's just beyond comprehension.
Yeah, their unbelief is astounding in that moment. Yeah, and again, that doesn't seem to be Mark's purpose with that story here. I don't know. Perhaps he's just emphasizing. I mean, again, I think Jesus, or Peter rather, in his denial, his confession of commitment to Jesus, I think he's completely sincere that he's willing to fight, he's willing to die with Jesus, but he's not just willing to stand with him. And I think that's true of all the disciples. And we see that here, that someone's willing to draw their sword and fight, but they're not willing to just stay with Jesus and to stand with him and go through the trial with him. And so they forsake him and flee away. All right, let's move into the next section here, verses 53 through 65. "And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. But Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. And he sat with the servants and warmed himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and all the council sought testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimonies did not agree. Then some rose up and bore false witness against him, saying, 'We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands.' But not even then did their testimony agree. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, 'Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?' But he kept silent and answered nothing. Again the high priest asked him, saying to him, 'Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?' Jesus said, 'I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven.' Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, 'What further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?' and they all condemned him to be deserving of death. Then some began to spit on him and to blindfold him and to beat him and say to him, "Prophesy." And the officers struck him with the palms of their hands. So Jesus has been arrested. He's been led away to the high priest, and that same group is there, the chief priests, scribes, and elders, these religious leaders who were the ones who have instigated this, the arrest of Jesus. And Peter's following along at a distance. So we do see a distinction between Peter and the other disciples here. While they all forsook him and fled, Peter stayed within striking distance. He's going to follow along and stay with Jesus here. And then they arrive, and the council is gathered together. And so, John Michael, what are the chief priests and elders seeking to do to Jesus here?
Verse 55 tells us that they kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death. But apparently they forgot to have that get Jesus meeting ahead of time because the testimony was just inconsistent to achieve the goal.
Very good. So there seems to be a lack of preparation here, that they're trying to find some testimony against him. They're willing to bring up false witnesses to testify against him. And yet the problem is they can't get their story straight. Nothing's lining up. And so they're asking Jesus, and Jesus is not responding to any of the accusations that they bring against him. And so question 7, David, what is the one thing that Jesus does answer, the high priest?
Well, since none of the false testimonies were working, the chief priest, which I'm sure was not in good motive, actually asked a legitimate question. Verse 61, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Jesus said, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." So he emphatically answers exactly who he is.
Yeah.
And no matter how you want to interpret the rest of that, I believe the point he's trying to make is eventually you're not going to even have to take my word for it. You're going to know exactly who I am.
Yeah, very good. So they're trying to find this testimony. None of it's working. And so the high priest sort of says, well, let's just see if we can get him to confess directly. So let's ask him. Do you not answer anything? But he keeps silent. And then he finally asks, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus' response is, I am. Which seems significant to me. That's the I am language that we know from the book of Exodus. This is who Jesus is. And this is the first time in the Gospel of Mark that we see Jesus openly proclaiming who he is, his identity, that I am the Christ. Over and over again, we see other people mention it. We see demons mentioning it. We see the disciples confessing it. But Jesus is always saying, be quiet. Don't say it. This is not to be made known publicly. And yet here, in this moment, Jesus confesses it. I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. This language is very similar to chapter 13, verse 26, where it says, then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And here it says, you will see the Son of Man coming, sitting at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. So we see that connection and that judgment of Jerusalem idea being connected here. And so they tear their clothes. They got what they wanted. What further need do we have of witnesses? You've heard the blasphemy yourself. There's no need to continue. We don't need any more false witnesses who can't get their testimony straight. He's confessed. And that seems significant to me. Throughout the book, chapter 2 and chapter 11, chapter 12, we've seen so many times where they come to Jesus with questions, and Jesus is able to answer it in a way that leaves them astounded, that leaves them with nowhere to go and leaves them dissatisfied. And yet in this moment, Jesus could have answered this question in a different way. But he just gives them the ammunition that they've been looking for to put him to death. Because now his hour has come. Brad, did you have your hand up?
John chapter 10, verse 18. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself. It's not that hard, especially when you are both judge and jury, to arrange for false witnesses, and yet despite their best efforts, they couldn't seem to pull it off. They couldn't do it until Jesus literally gave it to them.
Yeah, it just shows that Jesus is in complete control even in this moment. If he had just continued to be silent, he might have been set free because their testimony didn't agree. And yet he gives them exactly what they've been looking for. Let's go ahead and read verses 66 through 72 and consider the end of the chapter here. Now, as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came. And when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, you also were with Jesus of Nazareth. But he denied it, saying, I neither know nor understand what you are saying. And he went out on the porch, and a rooster crowed. And the servant girl saw him again and began to say to those who stood by, This is one of them. But he denied it again. And a little later, those who stood by said to Peter, Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean, and your speech shows it. Then he began to curse and swear, I do not know this man of whom you speak. A second time the rooster crowed. Then Peter called to mind the word that Jesus had said to him, Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And when he thought about it, he wept. So verse 66, it's one of the servant girls of the high priest that comes. So perhaps she was there in the garden. She might have been among that multitude sent from the chief priests, scribes, and elders to come and arrest Jesus. And perhaps had seen Peter with him. And she sees him in the courtyard, warming himself by the fire, and says, Hey, you were with him. And so, Chris, in what ways does Peter deny their accusations?
Well, I think in 2 ways, both physically and mentally, right? Because he's not, like all the other disciples, he's not there with Jesus. You know, he's outside in the courtyard, hiding in the shadows, you know, trying to see what happens, you know, perhaps out of curiosity or something. But he's not there with him. So he's already forsaken him in that way. He's given him this word, his oath, I'll be there with you to the end, and he's not. And then mentally, it's a hard issue. He's denying Christ. He's denying that he even knows him with you know, oaths and swearing. You know, he's sinning and doing this. And so I think in multiple ways, he's turning his back on sort of the deity that he knows Christ is.
Yeah, very good. So first of all, he's just forsaken him, and then now verbally he's denying him. And he says the first time she asks, says you were with Jesus of Nazareth, he's like, I don't even know what you're talking about. I don't understand. And then he begins to get more firm as they continually come to him and say, surely you were with him, for you're a Galilean. And yet he begins to curse and swear, I do not know this man of whom you speak. And then that heartbreaking moment of the rooster crowing, and he realizes what he has done. And when he thinks about it, he just weeps. And this is yet another instance of that sandwich construction, right? In verse 53 and 54, we see Peter coming into the courtyard with the people, and then we jump out of that story, and we see the trial of Jesus. And now we finish what happens in the courtyard with Peter and those with around the high priest and the elders and the scribes. And sandwiched within that, this description of Peter's denial amongst those who are around the trial that is happening, we see Jesus' only confession in the book of Mark of his identity. And so we get this contrast of Peter's denial of what he knew to be true because of his cowardice to Jesus' confession, this bold confession in a time of humiliation and difficulty. And so we see just how far away Peter is from where he should be, how far away he is from where Jesus has been trying to get him. He's still walking according to the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. He's still concerned with those who are around him and the reaction of those that are nearby to his faith. And it reminds me of Mark chapter 8. We saw Jesus say that whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him the Son of Man will be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. And that just reminds me of what we talked about, the sandwich of the Passover or the Lord's Supper in the midst of the description of the denial of the apostles. I think we see again this idea of when we are faithless, God remains faithful. That Peter should have been confessing who he knew Jesus to be to those who are around, and yet he shrinks because of that mindset of fear overcoming his faith. Kevin.
Clearly, they weren't going to take his word on it, so he had to offer evidence that he was not of Jesus. And how did he offer evidence? He became like the world by cursing.
Very good. Daniel, you have a comment?
Sorry.
No, you're good.
I know we're trying to stay in Mark 2. I can never hear this story without remembering what the account of Luke says, that the Lord turned and looked at him. They were within eyesight of each other. You don't get that from that, except that one example.
Yeah. Such a powerful moment.
Yeah, you know, in his fear, he fulfills God's word. The shepherd is instructed, and they fled.
Yeah.
And then when you look at the priest before, you know, they've been insulted, their pride's on the line. You actually have people here that would have been like Paul. They would have thought they were doing God's will and taking care of everything. But all of them ultimately are fulfilling God's will. They are leading Christ to the cross.
Very good. Appreciate everyone's comments and participation.